We want to share with you a scenario and some tools and frameworks as an offering. And it may be a scenario that might be familiar to some of you, either from your own experience or you've observed. We welcome you dropping a +1 as we share it. And that's the scenario of an organization that hires a leader of color. And that leader of color as an executive director may come in after a white executive director who may have been there a long time, may have been there as a founder, and as a way of really addressing issues of racial equity, these hopes for diversifying the organization, a leader of color is hired to step in. And the new EDs often aren't supported to make the broad shifts that are really necessary for lasting change around racial equity, because that is both cultural and structural work. The organization may be destabilized. The ED is then blamed for not achieving a goal that they actually didn't have the resources or support to really see happen. And we think about a transition as a person and not as a transition of a system. And our organizations are systems that have culture and structure at work. I don't know if you all have seen this, where also the ED sometimes gets fired and blamed for that. And so that situation, unfortunately, has happened. And I see some, unfortunately, +1s. Another element to this is that the board then gets responsive and hires a diversity, equity, and inclusion DEI expert or consultant who might come in and do a series of listening sessions with staff. And then, of course, you may have to relaunch a whole search process. And the board may consider this as a resolution, whereas the staff and the leadership are having a completely different experience of what's happening. And those are moments of real tension and conflict in an organization. And what do we do in those moments is some of the tools and frameworks we want to share. I'll pass to you, Liam.
Yeah, so that's like one composite example of like many ways we've seen equity conflicts mishandled at a structural level at an organization, right? So feel free to drop in the chat or in the Q&A if you have other examples of like themes that you've seen. We'd love to hear from you about what it looks like in your experience. We're going to be talking about dominant culture and conflict on an interpersonal and on a group and organizational level. And when we say dominant culture, we mean the structural power patterns that more broadly organize all of life and our resources along the lines of race, class, gender, sexuality, ability, religion, etc. And they show up in everything we do. And I feel like I shouldn't have to say this, but I'm going to. Like that, even if you're a BIPOC person or someone who is marginalized based on these dominant culture patterns, you are likely to reenact them either internally or to others because, and it's not personal, it's not your fault. It's just the water that we swim in. It's like this toxic river that just takes us along in its undertow. And unless we're actively practicing against the stream, we're going to be enacting its patterns in our work. And so in the article that we wrote recently, we talk about how we as organizations often entrain to the bigger dominant culture flow that we have to interact with. So nonprofits are often interacting with dominant culture institutions, either because they're trying to transform them or they need funding from them or whatever it is. And so rather than you can entrain to a system that's toxic, or like you can be the system that others entrain to, right? You can create a regenerative culture that other people are syncing up with. One practice that we, Jovita and I, bring to organizations to support with that on a group level is talking about dominant culture characteristics. And this is based off of Tema Okun's white supremacy characteristics. And so we have them grouped here as we do in our workbook, and they have to do with exceptionalism, power and control, external validation, binary thinking, and it sort of lists out pretty in a way that's easy to understand how these dominant culture patterns show up in our organizations. So what we do is just step one, bring this language, this shared framework to the group. so that we can depersonalize it and begin to have a shared language to work from and to identify the problem. So like each group or organization tends to have its own like white supremacy cocktail that is like its unique habits that are the most strong. I mean, we all have all of these probably, but in some groups it's really power hoarding, and in some groups it's more urgency and the inability to delegate or whatever. So that's one practice, to introduce these characteristics, to use them to identify what is not going as we would like it to, what's the status quo sort of toxic river version of how we operate. And then we start to generate some ideas for ways, like micro practices that we can apply as a group to address our sort of white supremacy cocktail. And starting small, really. Like, for example, for a group that has a lot of urgency, one practice they might commit to that they could apply right away is like, let's do a really thorough debrief after every big campaign we do. So we take a moment to breathe and really integrate rather than like move on to the next thing. And that's something that folks can like start to apply right away.